As a permaculture urbanist, I talk a lot about diversity, because diversity in its many different forms forms a tool set that I can use to help cities thrive. But these days there's a lot of fears about diversity. So in today's episode, we'll look at why people fear diversity, the triumph of culture over those fears, how cities extend that triumph by valuing and connecting diverse cultures, and how cities can take this trend to the next level by valuing and connecting a diversity of life. Welcome to Edenicity, Best Practices for Sustainably Abundant Cities. Now, here in the United States, early in 2025, there is basically a mass hysteria about diversity. If you go to social media, mainly X, you're deluged with images of people of color committing violence. Now, I addressed this directly in episode 94, when I looked at studies that aggregated police statistics from around the world. And we saw that there's this huge disparity between what your eyes tell you on X and what actual measurements show. And this makes sense. Musk's tweets are vastly amplified, and he amplifies the most incendiary material he can find. So it's not surprising that this triggered some people when I touched on topics of diversity in Edenicity. A viewer wrote that diversity was unquestionably horrific and unmanageable. It's not our strength. It's a divisive monster that eats common identity, civilized society, and solidarity. There were also more generalized concerns that have admittedly found their way into permaculture, as another viewer shared. He said that a permaculture-based world is meant to simultaneously be a transition to a world of small, closer-knit communities. This is true. Permaculture was very much informed by E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful and other grassroots environmental movements. The viewer continues by saying, you just can't have close-knit communities above a certain density. He referenced the Dunbar number, which we'll get to in a few slides. In his view, anything above about 500 people per square kilometer is not conducive to close-knit communities, and certainly not anything in the range of 2,000 to 5,000 people per square kilometer. And just so you know, the Edenicity land use concept is toward the upper end of that range, about 4,700. He also notes that suburbs are about 1,000 people per square kilometer, or about a fifth as many as you would find in a typical Edenicity plan. So diversity, that is to say, many people of different kinds close together, scares people. But why? Well, in all likelihood, this stems from our attachment anxiety that we have as infants. Whereas a part of the natural bonding process with our mothers and other caregivers, we naturally become suspicious of people that we're not familiar with. This stranger danger extends not just to people, but to foods and experiences. Anything that's new at some level we learn to be suspicious of. Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist at Oxford University, has made the case that people just lack the brain power to keep track of more than about 150 close relationships. So for the bulk of that 2.4 million year history, people have lived in close-knit groups of roughly 150 people or less. And the suspicions are intense. In chimpanzees, which were genetically only 2% different from, there can be really intense, deadly wars between different small groups. Now, this circle of strong attachment to your in-group comes with a strong aversion to out-groups. And Peter Turchin, also of Oxford University, has noted that in-group, out-group violence has cost anywhere from 10 to 60% of male lives prior to the dawn of civilization. But obviously today we live in a world where we're dependent on far more than 150 other people for our survival. People coordinate in groups of hundreds, thousands, even millions to meet each other's needs through a global economy. So what was the mechanism that let us get past this really deep limitation in how many people we could trust? In the archaeological excavation at Göbekli Tepe, there's evidence that up to thousands of people used to gather regularly for cultural observances. And according to Peter Turchin, it's the shared architecture, customs, art, adornment, and language that allow people to signal trust to an in-group that is larger than the Dunbar number. That is to say, if somebody follows the same customs as you, even if you have never met them before, people found that they could trust each other and work together and create things like this giant temple. And this allowed people to form large coalitions and eventually cities. Now, what makes cities really special is that they bring people together not just in one culture, but among many different cultures. And the evidence for this, according to Jonathan F.P. Rose, who is himself a large-scale urban developer, comes from the Ubaid period, about 7,000 years ago, when proto-cities were forming and the various trades were becoming quite specialized. This made cities places where people came to depend on more and more specialists, not only within the city, but also from other cities with other cultures. And so through specialization in trade, the proto-cities became places where different cultures interacted and brought each other wealth through the benefits of trade. The power of economic interdependence, of specialization and trade, has a direct lineage to the present day, when the European Union was able to vastly reduce a legacy of centuries of violent conflict. Jonathan Rose points out that cities became so successful at bringing specialized cultures together in a prosperous way that 89% of ancient Mesopotamia was urbanized, which is a far bigger figure than the entire world today. One of the areas of specialization during the Ubaid period was pottery, and it's amazing to think that this piece from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is something like 7,000 years old. Cities that made accommodations for people of multiple cultures have long thrived. For example, Islamic Cordoba was very accommodating of Jews and Christians, and the groups collaborated freely in science, the arts, and philosophy. Oh, and by the way, according to Jonathan Rose, these cities showed far less wealth inequality than today's societies and encouraged free trade by taxing wealth, not income. Cities that not only accommodate but welcome diversity are welcoming a golden age for themselves. In the modern era, for example, in Singapore, in 1962, it was desperately poor, with slums in the center and slums in the periphery, fires, race riots. But with the new government in 1965 came a policy of ownership for the people, which meant that the government committed to building as much public housing as it took to make sure that every citizen could own their own home. By the mid-80s, they were a prosperous modern city, and by 1989, they introduced the ethnic integration policy, which made sure that ethnic enclaves wouldn't form and exclude each other economically. And this policy also included ethnic quotas in politics and an integration policy in education that also provided language instruction in the mother tongue of each of the major ethnicities. And today, because of these decisions, which were deliberately made for economic advantage, 90% of Singapore citizens own their own homes, compared to about 66% for the United States. And as a whole, they're about 60% more wealthy. It's even possible for cities to recover from past mistakes where they didn't do enough to accommodate diversity. Bijlmermeer, in the outskirts of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, was built in the classic towers in the park model, where everything was separated. The highways were on a separate level from the walkways, which were also on a separate level from bikeways. The buildings were massive and very, very far away from workplaces, grocery stores, and shopping. When they were completed, unfortunately, most Dutch people didn't want to live there. So the properties ran down a bit, prices dropped, and when there was a wave of low-income immigrants from Suriname and Ghana, this proved to be a relatively affordable place for them to settle. Now, I remember in the early 1990s, I had a Dutch housemate who occasionally had family visits, and some of the things they said about the immigrants would just scorch your ears. The prejudice they had against these people was terrible. What was going on was you had a group of people who struggled to pay the bills, couldn't just run down to the grocery store because it was miles away, couldn't just bike to work because, again, it was a really long ways away, had a hard time finding work because of prejudice and isolation, were grappling with a whole new culture themselves. So yes, there was a lot of suffering, strife, and even, of course, crime. But the turning point came with redevelopment that followed a 1992 plane crash that destroyed several buildings in Bijlmermeer. The redevelopment included low-rises, mixed uses such as grocery stores and other shopping, and a public transit connection to the rest of the city. A local mosque was built so people felt both more connected to the city and to the rest of Holland, and also more at home since their culture was respected and recognized. Now, according to Jonathan Rose, the second generation, the children of these immigrants, were at parity for income and education by 2016. Now, as I mentioned in episode 94, there's a lot of people who resist immigration because people think the immigrants are going to compete for jobs, they're going to take up resources. But in fact, as they rise in society and get higher education and higher incomes, their demand for goods and services also rises. So if you think of the economy as like a game of musical chairs, immigrants arrive with their own chairs and then set about making the chairs even better. They broaden the tax base, they enrich society, and they bring economic connections potentially to other parts of the world. The lesson is clear. We need to design cities to value and connect a diversity of people. This includes mixed-use, mixed-income neighborhoods with appropriate religious and cultural facilities for the groups that are there, and public transit connections, which are healthier, 10 times cheaper, and 17 to 800 times safer than cars. And as always, I've put my sources in the description below. So it's really clear. Diversity is good for cities, good for civilization, and makes us all much wealthier. But that's just diversity in the human sphere. What if we go beyond the human sphere and extend this concept to the natural world. The next level for cities is to value and connect a diversity of life. And this is where we bring permaculture into urbanism. Permaculture is a design discipline to meet human needs for housing, food, energy, and fiber in a way that heals rather than harms the earth. But why do cities need this so much now? Well, we occupy half the land on Earth, and we've wiped out half the life. Today, soils are losing fertility fast, and I know this flies in the face of a lot of the propaganda film strips that we watched in grade school. But the loss of soil fertility and the fall of civilizations is an old story. Over a period of several centuries, for example, ancient Rome's soils lost 90% of their fertility, so it took 10 times as many acres to feed the same number of Romans toward the end as it did in the early days. And this caused a slow but catastrophic collapse for Rome. The city of Rome in the year 200, Common Era, had about 1 million people. But by 500, that number was down to 50,000. That's a 95% loss of population. By the year 1000, there were just 10,000 people or so living in small huts by the river amid the ruins. With mechanized agriculture, the rate of soil loss is so much faster than it ever used to be that if we don't change things quickly, the fall will be exponentially faster than it was for ancient Rome. So the question is, what do we need to do to bring the diversity of life into cities through permaculture? We need to design transit and structures that harvest rainwater, which is actually pretty easy to do. And it's begun to happen in many cities throughout the world today. We need to install water retention earthworks. Again, fairly easy to do and already underway in many cities. We need to cycle nutrients through composting, which we do at best maybe 3% of the time. Again, according to Jonathan Rose. So that's an area where we really need to make progress. We need to grow layered living landscapes that stack functions. And by that I mean that every element of a system has multiple jobs. A single tree, for example, provides shade, evaporative cooling, condensation drip at night, which can double the precipitation. It buffers stormwater in its trunk and roots. It holds the soil together. It provides potentially many different crops of food. It provides timber at the end of its life. And it provides habitat for many other animals that we might interact with, such as silkworms and many species of birds that can provide pest control. The layered living landscapes can also diversify our food supply, buffer floods and droughts, retain soil moisture and health, and recharge vitally needed groundwater. Doing these things will greatly diversify the ecology of cities to our great benefit. So the lesson today is that diversity is integral to the wealth of civilization and has been for thousands of years. Cities that value and connect a diversity of people thrive and always have. Cities that value and connect a diversity of landscapes and life wisely may enjoy permanent abundance rather than falling like ancient Rome. Okay, here are those other episodes that I talked about earlier. And thanks as always to the wonderful patrons who support this work. Take care, stay green, see you next time.